Music. When you think of medieval festivals, what pops into your head? Maybe a quiet church gathering, some solemn prayers, and a bit of candlelight? Well, hold on to your tunics, because that's not even close to the full story. Medieval festivals were anything but dull. They were loud, messy, and downright wild. Picture a giant street party that would make today's music festivals look like a polite tea party. Yes, really. Now, of course, medieval life had its share of religious observances and serious ceremonies, but festivals? Oh, those were a whole other beast. They were the ultimate excuse for people to let their hair down, or, well, the medieval equivalent, which might be a bit dirtier and definitely more chaotic. These events were packed with music that made your feet itch, dancing that twisted and turned through the streets, and feasts where the food and drink didn't just appear, they flowed like rivers after a storm. Ale, wine, and mead weren't just refreshments, they were the fuel for the party engine. But beyond the fun, medieval festivals had a serious cultural punch. They weren't just about having a blast, they were social glue, pulling together people from all walks of life. Lords rubbed shoulders with peasants, merchants exchanged jokes with monks, and everyone, no matter their station, got swept up in the shared celebration. For a few days, the usual rules of society loosened like a pair of old boots, and social boundaries blurred or sometimes just vanished entirely. It was a time when the rigid hierarchies could be flipped on their heads, and the kingdom became a giant dance floor open to all. You see, these festivals were more than just events, they were a vital part of medieval culture. They marked seasonal changes, religious holidays, and important civic occasions, but they also served as a release valve for the pressures of daily life. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't a walk in the park, there was hard work, strict rules, and plenty of hardship. Festivals were like the medieval version of a weekend getaway, except they might last several days and involve a lot more chaos. So, what really went down at these festivals? Were they just about kneeling and singing hymns? Nope. They were bursting with energy, noise, and often, just a little bit of mischief. Imagine streets filled with minstrels strumming lutes, jugglers tossing flaming torches, and crowds yelling for the next wild spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of less pleasant aromas too. But all of that added to the atmosphere, gritty, raw, and alive. And it wasn't just the common folk getting in on the fun. Nobles and clergy often joined the festivities, although sometimes with a bit more restraint, or at least they tried. Festivals were one of the few times when everyone could step out of their usual roles and just be part of the larger community. Of course, this temporary equality could cause some raised eyebrows among the more conservative types, but it was part of the charm and chaos of the season. One fascinating thing about medieval festivals is how they brought the entire town, or even the whole region, together. People traveled from miles around, and the event could last days, sometimes even a week. Markets popped up, entertainment troupes performed, and the streets turned into a swirling mix of colors, sounds, and smells. It was like the entire medieval world paused for a grand celebration, a massive communal breath before plunging back into the grind of everyday life. And speaking of social mixing, medieval festivals were a rare space where social classes mingled freely. Normally, peasants wouldn't dare to look a noble in the eye, but here? They danced together, shared meals, and exchanged jokes without fear of punishment. This blurring of lines was so pronounced that it sometimes freaked out the local authorities and church leaders, who worried that too much freedom might lead to disorder. But the people loved it, and honestly, who could blame them? It was a chance to escape the usual strictures and just have fun. Music. So, medieval festivals weren't just little churchyard gatherings, they were the medieval world's biggest parties, full of noise, color, and life. These events revealed a side of the Middle Ages that's often missing from our history books, the human, playful, and sometimes downright wild side. And as we peel back the layers, we'll see that festivals were about more than just fun, they were a social phenomenon that shaped medieval culture in profound ways. Stick around, because next up, we'll dive into the heart of the action, the activities, the costumes, the music, and the madness that made these festivals unforgettable. Trust me, you don't want to miss the justs, the plays, and the parades that turned medieval streets into stages for all kinds of wild revelry. Music fades. Music. Alright, now that we've set the stage with the wild vibe of medieval festivals, let's dive headfirst into the whirlwind of sights, sounds, and downright jaw-dropping antics that made these celebrations unforgettable. Imagine streets turned into a living, breathing theater where everyone, from the tiniest toddler to the grumpiest old noble, had a role to play. First up, justs. Yeah, those epic, two-night on horseback battles you've probably seen in movies. But medieval justs weren't just fancy shows for the elite, they were a huge part of festival entertainment, drawing crowds that packed the streets or gathered around makeshift arenas. Knights in shining armor charged at each other with lances, trying to knock their opponent off balance. The clash of metal, the thunder of hooves, and the roar of spectators created an electric atmosphere. And when a knight took a spectacular tumble? Well, the crowd loved that almost as much as the triumphs. It was like the medieval version of a wrestling match, but with more splinters. But jousting was just the tip of the medieval festival iceberg. Theatrical plays were another crowd favorite. These weren't your quiet, stuffy dramas, they were lively, often body performances that mixed humor, morality, and a bit of slapstick. Traveling troupes would set up stages right in the town square, performing tales of saints, sinners, and sometimes even poking fun at local figures. The plays were both entertainment and education, weaving in religious themes with plenty of laughs and surprises. Picture a jester slipping on a banana peel, except substitute banana peel for a muddy patch, and you're about halfway there. Music and dancing were the lifeblood of these festivals. Minstrels strummed lutes and pipes, filling the air with lively tunes that made feet tap and heads bob. Dances ranged from simple steps anyone could join to elaborate choreographed numbers performed by skilled dancers in colorful costumes. The streets often became giant dance floors, with people spinning, clapping, and sometimes just letting loose in ways they never could during the rest of the year. There was a real sense of communal joy, everyone was part of the rhythm, everyone was invited. Speaking of costumes, these festivals were a riot of colors and characters. People didn't just come as themselves, they dressed up in masks and costumes that transformed them into fools, saints, animals, or mythical creatures. The costumes weren't just for show, they were part of the festival's magic, turning the world upside down. Masks allowed people to hide their identities and step into new roles, encouraging mischief and mayhem. It was a time when the ordinary became extraordinary, and the streets were a parade of imagination and fun. And hey, let's not forget the food and drink. Festivals were a feast for the senses, and the smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet pies hung thick in the air. Taverns and stalls overflowed with ale, wine, and mead, often served by enthusiastic vendors eager to keep the party going. Drinking wasn't just encouraged, it was part of the ritual, lubricating the festive spirit and sometimes leading to the kind of wild behavior that would make a modern party planner nervous. But it was all part of the shared experience. Everyone raised their cups and toasted to health, happiness, and a good time. Now, the entertainers themselves, minstrels, jesters, and performers, were the rock stars of the day. Minstrels traveled from town to town with their songs and stories, often improvising to fit the mood or poke fun at local happenings. Jesters, with their colorful clothes and quick wit, were masters of comedy and satire, able to mock even the highest nobles without fear of retribution. Performers might juggle, dance, or perform daring acrobatics, keeping the crowd on the edge of their seats. They weren't just there to entertain, they were the catalysts for the wild revelry, encouraging the crowd to let go and join in the fun. One of the most fascinating aspects of these festivals was how they created a kind of temporary world, a bubble where normal rules were suspended, and creativity ruled. The combination of costumes, music, performances, and endless food and drink turned towns into magical places where anything could happen. people laughed louder, danced harder, and dared to be more outrageous than usual. It was a collective release, a momentary escape from the pressures and hierarchies of medieval life. Music. So, when you picture medieval festivals now, don't just imagine a bland procession or stiff ceremony. Think of a vibrant, noisy, colorful explosion of life, a place where knights jousted under the midday sun, jesters cracked jokes that made even the sternest lord chuckle, and the streets pulsed with music and laughter. Food and drink flowed freely, costumes transformed identities, and the whole community came alive in a shared celebration of joy and chaos. Next up, we'll peel back another layer and explore the fascinating social dynamics and the license people took during these festivals, the bold pranks, the role reversals, and the way the usual rules got tossed out the window. Spoiler alert, it's going to get even wilder. Music fades. Music. Alright, buckle up, because now we're diving into the downright rebellious heart of medieval festivals. This is where things get spicy, where the usual social order gets tossed out the window like yesterday's ale-soaked napkin, and everyone, yes, everyone, gets a shot at turning the world upside down. One of the most famous examples of this festival madness was the Feast of Fools. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a giant, rowdy costume party where the usual rules didn't just take a back seat, they got kicked off the coach entirely. During this feast, the lowliest members of the church or town could mock their superiors without fear of punishment. Bishops might be parroted by choirboys dressed in ridiculous outfits, and clergy could find themselves the butt of bawdy jokes that would make even a modern-day stand-up comedian blush. It was a time when the sacred and the profane mixed in the most unexpected ways. The Feast of Fools wasn't the only event where this kind of license reigned supreme. Across Europe, festivals often included moments where social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. Normally, peasants would bow low, nobles would keep their distance, and everyone knew their place in a strict, unyielding pyramid. But during these celebrations, that pyramid got flipped on its head. Peasants could mock nobles, servants could boss around their masters, and the absurd became the norm. It was like the whole society took a collective deep breath, shrugged off their daily roles, and said, for a while, let's just have fun. This role reversal wasn't just for laughs, it was a crucial social pressure valve. Living in a world where the gap between rich and poor was massive, festivals gave people a chance to poke fun at the powerful and even challenge authority, albeit temporarily and in a controlled environment. It was a way to keep the social order intact by letting people blow off steam in a socially acceptable way. Sort of like how a good comedy roast might save a friendship, except with more chainmail. And boy, did people get creative with their pranks and jokes. Public spectacles could get downright shocking. Imagine a festival where a peasant might parade through the streets dressed as a king, complete with a makeshift crown and scepter, while nobles played along, pretending to be their servants. Or a group of townsfolk staging a mock trial where the mayor was convicted of ridiculous crimes like excessive seriousness or failure to dance appropriately. These antics blurred the lines between reality and performance, leaving the audience wondering when the joke ended and real life began. Bawdy humor was another staple of the festival scene. Songs, plays, and street performances often featured risque jokes, double entendres, and cheeky references that would make a modern pub crowd cheer. The medieval world might seem stuffy from a distance, but its festivals revealed a side that was anything but. People loved to laugh at themselves and each other, especially when the usual decorum was thrown aside. Now, this wild social mixing wasn't always smooth sailing. Some of the more conservative members of society, especially church leaders, were not too thrilled about peasants mocking the clergy or nobles being lampooned. They worried that the freedom of festivals might lead to disrespect, disorder, or even rebellion. And sometimes, the festivities did get out of hand, leading to serious brawls or disruptions. But for the most part, these moments of license were tolerated because they served a social purpose, keeping the peace by letting people have their moment in the sun, or the mud, as it were. What's really fascinating is how deeply these festivals embedded the idea that for a brief time, the world could be a different place. A place where the timid could be bold, the poor could be powerful, and laughter was the great equalizer. The temporary lifting of social hierarchies created a shared experience that united everyone in a way that everyday life simply couldn't. Music. So, picture this, a festival street where a humble baker struts around in a noble's cloak, cracking jokes about the local lord's fashion sense, while the lord himself laughs and tries to keep his dignity intact. Or a troupe of performers staging a mock court where the village idiot is crowned king for a day, ruling with a scepter made of a crooked stick. These moments of role reversal and irreverence were the lifeblood of medieval festivals, and they brought a sense of fun and freedom that echoed through the community long after the last song faded. Next, we'll get into the messy business of excesses, yes, the drunken brawls, chaos, and sometimes downright destruction that could erupt when the ale kept flowing and tempers flared. Trust me, the party didn't always end peacefully, and the stories are as wild as you'd hope. Music fades. Music. Alright, now we're stepping into the messier, rowdier side of medieval festivals, the part where the ale wasn't just flowing, it was practically gushing, and things often spiraled into chaos. Because let's face it, when you mix crowds, booze, and a few too many high-spirited souls, you're setting the stage for some serious mayhem. Drunkenness was basically an unofficial hallmark of these festivals. People didn't just sip their ale politely, they guzzled it like there was no tomorrow, fueled by the excitement and the chance to escape everyday worries. And with alcohol loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions, the atmosphere became a hotbed for all kinds of wild behavior. From boisterous singing to raucous dancing that knocked over market stalls, the energy was off the charts. But it wasn't just harmless rowdiness. Fights broke out regularly, sometimes over trivial slights, sometimes sparked by old grudges flaring up in the festive heat. Imagine a tavern packed to the brim, voices raised, mugs flying, and suddenly fists are swinging. Street brawls were common, and with the crowd swelling during festivals, these scuffles could quickly escalate into full-blown melees that spilled into the streets and alleys. It wasn't unusual for local guards or watchmen to be called in to restore order, often having to separate warring factions and drag the most unruly off to jail. Sometimes the damage went beyond bruised egos and broken noses. Property destruction was a real risk during these wild celebrations. Market stalls could be toppled, windows smashed, and even church property wasn't always safe from the festive chaos. There are records of festivals where the revelry got so out of hand that entire sections of towns ended up battered and bruised, all thanks to a combination of too much drink and too little restraint. Now, this wildness didn't sit well with everyone. The church, for one, often had a love-hate relationship with these festivals. On the one hand, many festivals were religious in origin, tied to saints' days or holy celebrations. On the other hand, the church found the excesses, especially the drunkenness, bawdy jokes, and irreverent behavior, deeply troubling. Clergy would sometimes preach against the wildness, warning that such revelry risked offending God and leading souls astray. Local authorities were caught in the middle, trying to balance the need for order with the understanding that festivals were an important part of social life. Some towns imposed curfews or restrictions on drinking during festivals, while others went as far as banning certain types of behavior outright. But enforcement was tricky. During a festival, people were caught up in the excitement, and cracking down too hard could spark resentment or even rebellion. Despite the tension, festivals with their wild revelry left a lasting mark on local customs. Some towns became famous for their particularly rowdy celebrations, earning reputations that spread far and wide. Take, for example, the town of Chester in England, which hosted annual mystery plays that sometimes turned into 3-day-long parties featuring everything from theatrical performances to brawls and public pranks. Or the city of Metz in France, where the carnival was notorious for its drunkenness and chaos, forcing authorities to intervene regularly. These stories of excess and chaos aren't just amusing anecdotes, they reveal a lot about medieval society. Festivals were a pressure cooker, a place where people could blow off steam but also where tensions between classes and communities could boil over. The wildness could be dangerous, sure, but it was also a vital outlet in a world where daily life was often harsh and unforgiving. Music. So, picture this, the sun setting on a bustling festival day, the streets still alive with laughter and shouting, but now with spilled ale and overturned carts marking the aftermath. Guards trying to keep the peace as groups of still energized revelers argue over a lost hat or a misunderstood joke. The church bells tolling in the distance, a reminder that the sacred and the profane were always dancing on a knife's edge during these celebrations. Next, we'll take a look at how these medieval festivals left their mark on the world we know today, how the balance of sacred ritual and wild fun shaped traditions that still echo in modern carnivals and celebrations. Stick around, it's a fascinating journey from the muddy streets of the Middle Ages to the colorful parades of today. Music fades. Music. So here we are, at the final stretch of our medieval festival journey, and it's time to see how these wild, rambunctious celebrations didn't just disappear with the Middle Ages but actually left a lasting legacy that still echoes in the way we party today. First off, medieval festivals were the ancestors of many modern cultural traditions. Think about carnivals, Mardi Gras, and even Halloween. All of these have roots that trace back to the mix of sacred rituals and secular revelry that characterized medieval celebrations. The idea of dressing up in costumes, parading through the streets, and temporarily turning the social order on its head didn't vanish, it just evolved over time. The masks, the music, the role reversals, they all morphed into new forms but kept that same spirit of joyful chaos. This balance between the sacred and the secular is really what made medieval festivals so unique and influential. On one hand, you had serious religious observances honoring saints, marking harvests, celebrating holy days. On the other, you had feasting, dancing, pranks, and all-out merrymaking. These two sides weren't at odds, they actually complemented each other, creating a rich, layered experience that brought communities together. It was like a medieval mashup of church and party, solemnity and silliness, all rolled into one. And here's a cool thought, the wildness of medieval festivals shows us a more human, playful side of the Middle Ages, something that often gets overshadowed by tales of wars, plagues, and strict hierarchies. Behind the armor and the sermons were people who loved to laugh, dance, and let loose just like we do today. They craved moments of freedom, connection, and fun, and festivals were their way of grabbing that joy with both hands. The echoes of these festivals live on every time we throw on a costume or gather in the streets to celebrate. Whether it's the vibrant parades of a carnival or the raucous spirit of a music festival, there's a little bit of medieval magic in the mix. It's a reminder that, no matter how much the world changes, the human need to come together and celebrate remains as strong as ever. Music. So, if you're curious to dive deeper into the fascinating world of medieval life or just want more stories about knights, jesters, and wild parties, stick around and subscribe. We've got plenty more adventures lined up, and trust me, the Middle Ages were anything but boring. Raise your goblets, everyone, and here's to the wild, wonderful spirit of medieval festivals. May their echoes keep inspiring our celebrations today.